So, it is well known, the halacha, that if a person encounters a lost object of his father, together with the lost object of his Rabbi, and he can only take one, he can only return one, so he returns the lost object of his Rabbi, Avedis Rabbi Kaidemes, and the Mishnah in Bava Metzia tells us because his father brings him to Olam Hazeh, and his Rebbe brings him to Olam Haba, and therefore his Rebbe's Aveda takes precedence. So just the lashon of the Mishnah is in Bava Metzia Lamed Gimel that Aviv Hiviu LaOlam Hazeh v'Rabbi Shalamdai Chachma Mevi'ai L'Chayei HaOlam Haba. So just Rav in Gematria is 202. Chachma is 73. Rav and Chachma is 275. Gematria Rav and Chachma is 275, which is the exact same Gematria with the Kailo of Mevi'ai L'Chayei HaOlam Haba. That's what a Rav with the Chachma one gets from the Rav. It's the same Gematria, it's the same essence of Mevi'ai L'Chayei HaOlam Haba. So it's a big schus to be in a place where there's a Rav that's imparts Chachma, and there's an olam that appreciates that they have a Rav who gives Chachma, that is Mevi'ai L'Chayei HaOlam Haba. It's a very, very big schus to be here. So thank you very, very much. Okay, so we'll talk about the sugya. So we have the Mishnah in Bava Metzia that it tells us that the Aved of the Rav, of the Rebbe, takes precedence, and one should forget about the Aved, the lost object of his father, and be Isaac and return the Aved of his Rebbe, because his Rebbe is Mevi'ai L'Chayei HaOlam Haba, brings him to Olam Haba. His father just brought him to Olam Hazeh. Good. Mishnah Bava Metzia Daf Lamed Gimel. The issue is that we go to Krisus, and at the end of Masechtas Krisus, the last Mishnah, in fact, in Masechtas Krisus, the end of Masechtas Krisus, it tells us something we'll get back to a little bit later. It says, Ha'av chaydim la'ein b'chol makom. It says if a person has a situation where he can either do the Kibud Av or the Kibud Ein, so his father takes precedence. Why? The Mishnah introduces us to a svara mivnei shehu ve'imai chayavin b'kvei aviv. The child and the mother are obligated in the covet of the father, and therefore, in regard to the child, the father comes first because hu ve'imai chayavin b'kvei aviv. But then the Mishnah concludes, and the Mishnah says that if the ben was zoicha to learn by a Rebbe, and now he has a Rebbe and he has his father, says the Mishnah increases, the Rebbe takes precedence b'chol makom. In every situation, in every type of scenario, the Rebbe takes precedence over the father. Mivnei shehu va'aviv chayavim b'kvei Rabbi. He and his father are obligated in the covet of the Rebbe. The Rebbe is the Talmud Chacham. So the child and the father are obligated in the honor and the covet of the Rebbe, and therefore the Rebbe takes precedence over the father. And here is something amazing. The Mishnah in Krisus and the Mishnah in Bava Metzia are both coming to the same conclusion, that when there's a situation of either your father or your Rebbe takes precedence. The conclusion of the Mishnah in Bava Metzia is the same as the conclusion of the Mishnah in Krisus, but for different reasons. The Mishnah in Bava Metzia says the Rebbe takes precedence because the Rebbe brings you to Olam Haba. Your father just brought you to Olam Hazeh. That's the reason of the Mishnah in Bava Metzia. However, the Mishnah in Krisus gives an entirely different reason. And the reason of the Mishnah in Krisus is because the father and the son are both obligated in the covet of the Rebbe. So just like you put your father before your mother, because the child and the mother are chayiv in the covet of the father, so too the Rebbe comes first because the father and the child are both obligated in the covet of the Rebbe. Two different reasons. Same conclusion, but for two different reasons. It's the steer in the Mishnayos. What do we need two reasons for? Why is it necessary to have two different reasons? And it would seem to be a machlokes in the Mishnayos. The Mishnah in Bava Metzia doesn't hold of the reason of the Mishnah increases. And the Mishnah increases doesn't hold of the reason of the Mishnah in Bava Metzia. It would seem that they're arguing on what their proper reason is. Even more, we could probably find halachic differences between that will come out based on what reason you give. So, for example, let's say the father himself is a Talmud Chacham. Let's say the father is even a bigger Talmud Chacham than the Rabbi, but the father never learned Torah with his son, if there's such a thing. Maybe it's a good idea that's a separate thing. When fathers learn with their kids, the kids feel pressure. Yeah, separate thing for 2025. But let's say you have a situation where the father is a big Talmud Chacham, bigger than the Rebbe, and he didn't teach his son any Torah, but the Rebbe taught the son Torah. And then there's a lost object, so who takes precedence? If we go with the Mishnah in Krisos, well then the father takes precedence because the father is a bigger Talmud Chacham. The whole reason of the Mishnah increases is because the father is also obligated in the kavod of the Rebbe. Well, here the father is a much bigger Talmud Chacham. He's not obligated in the kavod of the Rebbe. So if we go with the reason of the Mishnah increases, the father will take precedence. However, according to the reason of the Mishnah in Bava Metzia, that the Rebbe brings the child to Olam Haba and the father just as Olam Hazeh, well, in this case, the father never learned Torah with his son. So therefore, the father's only bringing him to Olam Hazeh, not to Olam Haba. Whereas the Rebbe's learning Torah with the son. So the Rebbe's bringing the child to Olam Haba. So therefore, according to the Mishnah in Bava Metzia, the Rebbe would take precedence. So we can even create halachic differences, halachic nafkaminas, between the Mishnah's reason in Bava Metzia and the Mishnah's reason in Krisos. That's the point that the Aruch LaNer in Krisos makes. So, what is it? Is a machlekes here? We need both reasons. One reason is enough. They're arguing the two stam mishnayos. What is going on here? The pliya is that it seems like before a couple hundred years ago, it was not raised in the Mefarshim. We see that Rav David Luria in his notes at the end of Masechtas Krisos asked the question. Right? The Orach Chaim HaKadosh in his Sefer on Shulchan Aruch asked the question. But, in the Rishonim, to my knowledge, we don't find that this issue is raised in the Rishonim. First one that I be aware of is, I think, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh in his Sefer on Shulchan Aruch. But it needs a hezbollah. What's going on over here? What's the pshat? It's both reasons. Machlekes, it's a stira. What is going on over here in these two mishnayos? So let's try to see if we can come to some understandings of these two mishnayos. The halacha in Shulchan Aruch, the beginning of Siman Reish Mem Beis. Siman Reish Mem Beis is Hilchos Kvoid Rabbi v'Talmud Chacham. Right? If you have, I gave 15 pages. I really had 20, but I only gave 15. Right? So the one that says 11 at the bottom, the way I sent it, is the Shulchan Aruch Siman Reish Mem Beis Hilchos Kvoid Rabbi v'Talmud Chacham. The first halacha, Chayev Adam v'Kvoid Rabbi v'Yirasai Yoser Mivishol Aviv. Good. Person's chayev halacha starts. That's how we start this siman in Shulchan Aruch. A person's chayev and he's obligated in the kavod of his Rebbe more so than in the kavod of his father. Great, simple halacha. Chayev adam b'kvoid rabbi v'yirasai yoser mivishal aviv. What do you think the source for this halacha is? Anyone want to take a guess of what the source for this halacha is? Anyone? Right. How many mishnayos would you say is the source of this halacha? Right. So, right. I would say the source of this halacha is a Mishnah in Bava Metzia and a Mishnah in Krisos. Both of those mishnayos tell us that one is obligated in the honor of his Rebbe more so than his father. The Mishnah in Bava Metzia for its reason, the Mishnah in Krisos for its reason. So I would say that the source, the makar of this halacha is the Mishnah in Bava Metzia and the Mishnah in Krisos. If one looks at the side of the Shulchan Aruch at the Be'er HaGoyla, the Be'er HaGoyla says that. The first Be'er HaGoyla, Aleph, The Baragayla brings the source, Mishnah Bava Metzia, Daf Lamed Gimel Amid Aleph, Uvesaif Krisus. Great. The Baragayla brings two sources. You have a Mishnah Bava Metzia, a Mishnah in Krisus. That's the source for the halacha here in Shulchan Aruch. Makes a lot of sense. Yeah?
Is there a possible difference? So I noticed the Mishnah in Krisus speaks about Kibud and Mora, but the Mishnah in Bava Metzia talks about just Kadima. It starts with you, meaning when you're protecting your own object, so it's you before everyone else.
Excellent. So let's try to develop along those lines. So great. We have here the Bar HaGayla. Bar HaGayla gives us the source as both Mishnayos. But if one looks at the Bir HaGra from the Vilna Gaon, we know that throughout Shulchan Aruch, the Vilna Gaon always provides the sources for the halachas that the Shulchan Aruch says. And one looks at the first Bir HaGra on this halacha, says the Gaon, Chayev, Zok the Vilna Gaon, Masnisan Soif Krisus. Mishnah, the Vilna Gaon says that the source of this halacha is the Mishnah at the end of Krisus. The Vilna Gaon totally ignores the Mishnah in Bava Metzia. Everyone knows the Mishnah in Bava Metzia, right? The kids in kindergarten come back knowing the Mishnah in Bava Metzia. Most people don't know the Mishnah in Krisus. And the Vilna Gaon says the source for this halacha is the Mishnah at the end of Krisus. And he totally ignores the Mishnah in Bava Metzia. What's the pshat in the Vilna Gaon? Why couldn't he just say like the Bar HaGayla, that there are two Mishnayos that support this halacha? There's a Mishnah in Bava Metzia and a Mishnah in Krisus. But for some reason, the Vilna Gaon chooses to ignore the Mishnah in Bava Metzia and just draw our attention to the Mishnah in Krisus. What in the world is the pshat here in this Vilna Gaon? Okay, so we have to understand this Vilna Gaon. So again, we have to understand what's going on with the two Mishnayos. Two reasons, arguing, not arguing. We have to understand the two Mishnayos. And now we have to understand this Vilna Gaon. Why would he reference just the Mishnah in Krisus and not the Mishnah in Bava Metzia? Page 12 is a halacha further on in that same siman in Shulchan Aruch. And this is the Mishnah in Bava Metzia itself, in Sif Lamed Daled. So the Shulchan Aruch says, Avedis Aviv, V'Avedis Rabbi, Avedis Rabbi Kaidemis. Right? So that's the halacha of the Mishnah, that if you have a choice, you can only return one lost object, father, Rabbi. The Rabbi takes precedence. That's the halacha paskin here in Sif Lamed Daled. There's a very interesting Ramah on that halacha. The Ramah, at the end of the Ramah on that halacha, the Ramah says, Yesh Oimrim, Chad Rabbi Kaidem La'aviv, Hainu Shaloimid Imay Bechinam. This whole halacha only applies to a Rebbe that learns with the child for free, without charging. Avalim Aviv Seicher Loi Rebbe Umalamdai. But if the father pays the Rebbe to learn with the child, Aviv Kaidem L'chol Davar, then the father comes first. So, if the father pays the tuition, right, and he pays for the Rebbe to learn with the child, so then the Rebbe doesn't come first for the Aveda, and the father's Aveda comes first. The father pays tuition for the child, the father comes first. The Ramah says the source of this is a Sefer Chasidim, and says the Ramah, V'chein nira li ikar. That's what seems to me to be the halacha, that if the father pays the Rebbe, then the father's Aveda comes first. This Sefer Chasidim is very, very logical based on the Mishnah in Bava Metzia. The whole reason for the Mishnah in Bava Metzia is the Rebbe comes first. Why? Because the Rebbe brings to Olam Haba. Well, you know what? If the father's paying the Rebbe, so then the father is bringing to Olam Haba. The father's causing the child to be able to get Olam Haba, so therefore the father will take precedence. This Sefer Chasidim makes a lot of sense if we go with the reason of the Mishnah in Bava Metzia. But according to the Mishnah in Krisus, I have a much more difficult time with this Sefer Chasidim and with this Ramah. According to the Mishnah in Krisus, the Rebbe takes precedence because the child and the father are chayiv in the kavod of the Rebbe, of the Talmud Chacham. Well, that doesn't change, right? There's still a chiyuv to honor the Talmud Chacham, even though you're paying him tuition, you're paying him to learn, right? I hope when I walk into shul, people still give me some kavod, even though I'm getting a salary. I hope, right? It should be like that, right? So, according to the Mishnah in Krisos, this Sefer Hasidim is very, very hard to understand. Just because the father is paying tuition, so the father comes first, what happened to you and the father are both chayiv in the kavod of the Rebbe? So this Ramah, who's paskening like the Sefer Hasidim, it would seem maybe perhaps this is another halachic nafkamina between the two Mishnayos. Maybe. So is the Ramah and the Sefer Hasidim paskening like the Mishnah of Metzia over the Mishnah in Krisos? What is going on over here? What's the pshat? So that has to be understood. There's Rav Kiva Eger, fascinating Rav Kiva Eger on this Ramah. And Rav Kiva Eger brings an additional facet, an additional psak from the same Sefer Hasidim that the Ramah didn't mention. And Rav Kiva Eger brings something else from that same Sefer Hasidim. And says Rav Kiva Eger, not only if the father pays tuition to the Rebbe, does the father's Aveda come first, but even if there's a random person, a friend of mensch, a random person, that he goes and he creates a scholarship. He says, I'm paying the tuition for a worthy child to come and learn Torah in this yeshiva. Says the Sefer Hasidim, if that random person who's paying a child's tuition, and then there's a situation where there's a lost Aveda of the random person who pays the tuition and the child's father, the random person comes first because he's paying the tuition. And if it's the random person and the father, the random person and the Rebbe, the random person comes first who's paying the tuition of the child. Same svara, says Kiva Eger brings it, same svara, because it's that random person who's paying the tuition that's miviyai l'chayei ha'olam haba. So the same svara, the Sefer Hasidim, extends to even a random person that pays the tuition. His Aveda comes first because he's bringing the child to Olam Haba.
What about like carpool?
What?
What about carpool?
If you get
to school without carpool,
if you get
to school.
I hear that. Okay. Let's see at the end how we can come out with that. Right? That is the Sefer Hasidim that Rav Kiva Eger brings, and Rav Kiva Eger says it's very, very logical like that Sefer Hasidim. So I have a question as follows. To a father, even though it's not practiced so much for whatever reason, but really the halacha is that one stands up for his father, right? One stands up for his Rebbe. So if there's someone, totally random person that's paying tuition for a child, and that person walks into the room, does the child have to stand up?
Sounds like you should.
Nah, to me, that would be a tremendous chiddush that the child would have to stand up. Right? There's no chiyuv. We don't find anywhere that there's a chiyuv of kavod for the person that pays a child's tuition. Right? That doesn't create a chiyuv of kavod. There's just takes precedence in returning an aveda, but it doesn't create a chiyuv of kavod. Right? The child would be sitting there, and this person that's paying a scholarship for him walks in. The child would not have an obligation to stand up. There's no chiyuv of kavod. Right? Let's go a step more to examine this. This is a Tosefta, and the Tosefta talks about this halacha that the Rebbe takes precedence over the father. Right? This Tosefta. The Tosefta talks about the Rebbe takes precedence over the father. And the Tosefta has a Havamina, and the Tosefta has a Havamina to say that it's even your Rebbe that teaches you umnus. Even your Rebbe that teaches you real estate, mortgages, how to sell on Amazon, whatever it is. If you have a Rebbe that was your professor and taught you how to make parnasa, the Tosefta has a Havamina that Rebbe in business has a lost object, and your father has a lost object. The Rebbe he taught you business, his object should come first. So if the Tosefta, no, that's not correct. But the Tosefta has a Havamina that your Rebbe in business, his Aveda takes precedence over your father's Aveda. What in the world is the Havamina to say such a thing? Right? Is there any chiyuv of kavod to the person that taught me business? I was an apprentice by someone and I learned how to be a tailor by him. So now I'm chayiv to be mechabed him. There's halachas of machiloi, mashkeyu, right? What?
It's a svara.
That what?
Appreciation.
You're just as good as you were in 6th grade, Hershey.
You just stop learning.
So l'chayra, it's klar from this Tosefta, and Rav Moshe really says this in a tshuva. He doesn't bring the Tosefta, but the Yesod, Rav Moshe says in a tshuva that the idea of the Mishnah in Bava Metzia with Aveda is not mehilchas kibud. It has nothing to do with kavod. It has to do with hakaras hatoyv. The idea of having to return one Aveda over the other is nothing to do with kavod. Kavod is giving food, giving drink, giving clothing, like the Mishnah in Kedushin outlines what kavod entails. Returning someone's Aveda is not mehilchus kavod. It's not serving the person, that's not kavod. That's something else. That's a sugya of hakaras hatoyv. If returning the Aveda is a sugya of hakaras hatoyv, so then I can already understand that the guy that taught me business and gave me parnasa for my life, I should have hakaras hatoyv to him, and maybe his Aveda takes precedence because I have hakaras hatoyv to him. Right? There's such a svara, havamina at least. Man, now that Tosefta makes more sense why it would have such a havamina. And now the Sefer Hasidim also takes on a new dimension. I understand that the person who pays tuition for a child, there's no chiyuv of kavod to that person, but there's a chiyuv of hakaras hatoyv. So the child doesn't have to stand up when that person walks in, but there's hakaras hatoyv. And therefore, it's the hakaras hatoyv, his Aveda will take precedence because I have hakaras hatoyv. That person is bringing me to Olam Haba.
Isn't it a matter from Tosfos that we're discussing kavod?
I'm sorry, what?
Isn't it a matter from Tosfos about Metzia that we're discussing kavod?
Oh, okay. Well, let's wait and we'll get there. We're just talking now what's possible to say. Right? So, based on this, we could understand that the two sugyas are separate sugyas. Bava Metzia is not a sugya of kavod. Krisus is not a sugya of hakaras hatoyv. In Krisus, we're talking about kavod. In kavod, so then the Rebbe takes precedence. Why? Because in Hilchas Kavod, there's a svara, a logic, that you and your father are chayiv in the kavod of the Rebbe, so the kavod of the Rebbe takes precedence. Krisus is a sugya of kavod. But Metzia has nothing to do with kavod. But Metzia is Aveda. That's a different sugya. That's hakaras hatoyv. Hakaras hatoyv. So the Mishnah, I have more hakaras hatoyv for the one that brings me to Olam Haba than I have for the one that brings me to Olam Hazeh, and therefore the Aveda of the Rebbe takes precedence. So sugya of hakaras hatoyv. Memela now the Sefer Hasidim, we understand I have hakaras hatoyv to the person that brings me to Olam Haba by paying my tuition, and therefore his Aveda takes precedence. Now, if we look again back at that first halacha in Siman Reish Mem Beis, what was that first halacha in Siman Reish Mem Beis? Chayev Adam b'kvoid Rabbi v'yirasai yoiser midishel aviv. That first halacha is a halacha of kavod. Right? It's not talking about Aveda in that first halacha. Memela zok the goyin. What's the makar for that halacha? Krisus. It has nothing to do with Bava Metzia. Bava Metzia is not covered. Bava Metzia is talking about a karasatayim. It's a different sugya. When the Mechaber Paskins halacha of Chayev Adam B'Kvoid Rabbi V'Yarasa Yosem Mishal Ovid, that's covered. Covered. Zok the goyin. That's krisus. That's not Bava Metzia. Therefore, the goyin ignores the makar from Bava Metzia and only mentions the makar from krisus, because two separate sugyas. This would be one way of reconciling the two Mishnayos. Now it's not a stira, there's no difference, they're both aligned. It's two different sugyas. There's a sugya of kavod, that's in krisus. There's a sugya of akar satayv, that's in Bava Metzia. Two different svaras, two different worlds, no stira whatsoever, beautiful, straightforward, and everything is bob b'mekaymai b'shalom, and we understand the two separate sugyas. Rabbi Yehuda was he was known for his sharp, he was known for his one-liners. So Rabbi Yehuda was once approached by a doctor in the community, very wealthy doctor. Everyone wanted to curry favor with that doctor. And the doctor came over to Rabbi Yehuda with all the arrogance that the doctor had, and he said to Rabbi Yehuda, he said to him, I'm much more chashuv than you. I go to a chasna, you're at the chasna, everyone leaves you, they come to talk to me. Everyone congregates around me. I come into shul, I get the kavod, you don't get the kavod. I'm much more chashuv than you are. Rabbi Yehuda said back to the doctor, he said, you know, the people are 100% right. You deserve much more kavod than I do. Yeah, you deserve much more than I do. They're 100% right. The doctor was shocked. What do you mean? Weisler said, you know, Mishnah says that you give kavod to the Rabbi because he's meviyai l'chayei ha'olam haba. Said, you know what? Not so clear, not so simple. Maybe the Rebbe's teaching Torah wrong. Maybe the Rav's psak was not the right psak. So does the Rav bring l'chayei ha'olam haba? Not so pashut. But you're a doctor. A doctor definitely brings people l'chayei ha'olam haba. Sorry, Dr. Kakis. Sorry. In other words, the same idea is in the story of Rabbi Yehuda. Just, you know, it's a vitz to bring it out. You know, the svara in the Mishnah of Metzia is a separate svara. It's not, has nothing to do with Hilchas Kibud. It's a separate svara that is, you know, that stands by itself. Just interesting, it would come out from our discussion, an interesting halacha l'maisa ramification. If someone, Rachmana litzlan, if someone had a medical emergency and he was saved, his life was saved by a doctor or by someone in Hatzolah, that person saved his life, right? And now he's walking around kachad ha'am because the doctor or the Hatzolah person saved his life. And then that person is in a situation where two people ask him for a taiva, ask him for a favor, and he can only do the favor for one. One of the people that asked him is the Hatzolah person that saved his life, and another person is just a person. And they're both asking for a favor, and he can only do one. L'chayra would come out from this discussion with this Sefer Hasidim that it's not just, it's a halachic imperative to do the favor for the one that saved your life. Like that's what we're seeing from the Sefer Hasidim, that it's codified in halacha that there's a chiyuv of akaras hatayv, and for that chiyuv of akaras hatayv, I have to give precedence to that person, and the Sefer Hasidim's putting that down in halacha, not in the world of midas, it's in the world of halacha, that The person paid my tuition. I'm obligated to be market toiv and return his aveda first because he brings me to olam haba. So if there's somebody that restored my olam hazeh and I'm here because of that person, and I have a choice between this person who gave me my continued olam hazeh and a random person, and they're both asking me for a favor, l'chayra, based on this Sefer Hasidim, it would be halachic that one would give precedence to do the favor for the person that restored his olam hazeh. Yeah.
Wasn't that only wasn't that only a Havamina in the Tosefta that you mentioned that to be medame the Hakaras?
Right. So that was when it's in conflict with your father. That was the Havamina. But yes, there would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
If someone, let's say, paid tuition for a person's child, and you act differently towards them, isn't that a form of ribus?
It's a good question, but that would not fit into ribis because you're not getting paid back the loan, right? That was a gift. It's not, so it would not fall into ribs. So good point. Okay, so this would be a nice mahalach to reconcile the two different Mishnayos. However, like was mentioned, we see in some Rishonim that they clearly did not hold like this. If you look at the Bartanura, for example, and the Mishnah in Krisus, the Rambam, Pirush Mishnayos, and there are other ways of being medayik from the Rishonim. Some Rishonim equate the two Mishnayos. The Bartanura in Krisus brings the idea of Aveda onto the Mishnah in Krisus. So clearly you see from the Bartanura that he's not learning that it's two separate sugyas, but he's learning that it's really one sugya, and it's the same halacha that both Mishnayos are talking about. So according to the Bartanura and other Rishonim, how do we, again, we're back to the drawing board, we're back to the starting point of how do you reconcile the two Mishnayos if they're talking about the same inyan? They're both talking about Aveda. So what do you need two different reasons for? And the two different reasons seem to be in conflict. So this is a nice mahalach if we could learn that they're two separate sugyas. But if some Rishonim equate the two Mishnayos, then we're back to the starting point of how do we reconcile the stira? How do we reconcile the conflict between the two Mishnayos?
What's the Havamina? I mean, Tosaf's on the page is discussing that it's a case of Kibud. So how do you get across a Tosaf?
Right. So again, from some Rishonim, it's clear that it's the same thing, and you can't say this like is l'chayra mucha from the Vilna Gaon. So let's see if we could, find a mahalach that would work for these Rishonim also. And there are different ways of learning. Let's perhaps suggest one way of learning. And the aside of this way is really in the Orach Chaim HaKadosh's Sefer that's not so commonly used on Shulchan Aruch. The idea is there. But let's preface with the famous Rashi that we're going to learn in a few weeks. Rashi, the pasuk, Vayizbach Zvochem Lelokei Aviv Yitzchak. Yaakov in Parshas Vayigash on his way down to Mitzrayim brings karbonis Lelokei Aviv Yitzchak. And Rashi poses the question from the Medrash, that why does it say Lelokei Aviv Yitzchak and not mention, why didn't he bring karbonis for Lelokei Aviv, his grandfather Abraham? And Rashi brings from the Medrash that we see from here that a person is obligated in the kavod of his father more than the kavod of his grandfather. Right? That's what Rashi brings from the Medrash. And that is how the Ramah paskins. The Ramah paskins that a person is chayiv to in the kavod of his grandfather, but he has a greater chayiv in the kavod of his father. In fact, one of the Talmud of the Trumas Hadeshen, the Leket Yosher brings that if you have a shayla of who to give sandakais to, your father or your grandfather, the Talmud of the Leket Yosher says you give sandakais to your father because you're more obligated in the kavod of your father than in the kavod of your grandfather. If it comes to Lamaisa, speak to your Rav what to do. But that's what the Leket Yosher says, that yours because you're chayiv in the kavod of your father more than the kavod of your grandfather. just to, not to be Meirich. But Rav Kiva Eger, not to go into the whole thing, famous tshuva from Rav Kiva Eger, where he brings, phrase it like this, he brings phrase it as a question from the Sefer Levias Chain. And the Levias Chain has a question on this halacha. Because we learned in the Mishnah earlier that there's a halacha that if the father asks you for something and the mother asks you for something, the father takes precedence because Ata v'imecha chayavim b'kvod avicha. You and your mother are both obligated in the covet of your father. So the father takes precedence. So Frekt Rav Kiva Eger from the Levias Chaim, we should say the same thing by a father and a grandfather. Ata v'avicha chayavim b'kvod ziknacha. Right? You and your father are chayav in the covet of the zayda. So how can the father's covet be more? You should say that you and your father are both chayiv in the covet of the zayda, and therefore the zayda should come first, not the father. That's the question of the Levias Chain that Rav Kiva Eger brings, the question on this Ramah. The Gewaldige question. Rabbi Yosef Engel, in Kedushin, Rabbi Yosef Engel says a beautiful, beautiful teretz to this question. Rabbi Yosef Engel says as far, I wake up in the morning and I have to go to Shacharis. Minyan. I have different choices of where I could go to Shacharis. I could go to this shul, I could go to that shul. One shul after Shacharis is having steak and eggs. So that could weigh out, and I'm going to go to that shul for Shacharis because they have the steak and eggs, right? The two shuls were equal, right? But now the steak and eggs weigh out, and I'm going to end up in that shul for Shacharis, and I'll have the steak and eggs after. That's one scenario. You can have another scenario where I belong to that shul. I'm close to the Rav. That's where my chaver is. I belong to that shul. That's where I'm connected to. Even if I hear that there's another shul having steak and eggs after Shacharis, I'm not going to go there. Because this is my place. I belong here. I'm connected here. It's not going to outweigh. The steak and eggs, it doesn't matter. It's not going to outweigh. I'm going to be there because I belong there. Two different scenarios. The steak and eggs make a difference when both things are equal. It will outweigh and say, okay, let's give precedence here in the two equal things. But when the two things aren't equal, then steak and eggs don't make a difference. Says Rav Yosef Engel, the svara of Ata v'imecha chayavim b'kvod avicha is a svara when two things are equal. The chiyuv of kavod to your father is the same chiyuv of kavod to your mother. In fact, the Gemara tells us if the parents are divorced, then they're equal. One kavod kibud doesn't take precedence over the other. They're equal. So the chiyuv of kibud to your mother is identical and equal to the chiyuv kibud to your father. When you have two equal things, the svara of atava imecha chayavim b'kvod avicha is steak and eggs. And it says, okay, if they're both equal, then let's go in this direction and not that direction. However, says Rav Yosef Engel, the chiyuv of kavod to your father and the chiyuv of kavod to your grandfather are not two equal things. You're chayiv and kavod to your father more than to your grandfather. They're not two equal things. If they're not two equal things, the svara of ata v'avicha chayavim b'kvod zayda doesn't come into play. It's not negeya, because your chiyuv kavod is here. This is where you belong by your father giving him kavod. It doesn't make a difference to you that your father's also chayiv in the kavod to your grandfather. Doesn't make a difference because this is where your chiyuv kavod is to your father. So therefore, the svara doesn't make a difference. That is one idea. Let's just quickly say another idea. The question is, where does the chiyuv of kavod to your Rebbe come from? What's the source for that? Pashtus, one would say that there's a Taisus in Bava Kama, the famous Gemara, Shimon o Emtsuni ayedirish kol esen shebetayra, until he came to Es Hashem Elokecha Tira, and then what can I dash in there? He was Pirish. Rabbi Akiva comes along and says, Es Hashem Elokecha Tira is l'Rabbi's Talmidei Chachamim. So Pashtus, one would say, the chiyuv of Kibud to your Rebbe comes from Es Hashem Elokecha Tira, the Rabbi's Talmidei Chachamim. However, there's a mabit. There's a mabit that the mabit says, a dover nifla ad ma'oy. And says the mabit, mamish dvarim nifloim. Says the mabit, the chiyuv kavod to a Rebbe comes and is learned because it's a dimension of chiyuv of kibud av. Says the mabit, the Torah calls a Rebbe a father. Vishinantam levanecha elu hatalmidim. A Rebbe is called a father. Memela says the mabit, the imkain nichlal harav b'tzivui kivud umayra ha'av. A Rebbe is a father, and therefore the same way there's a chiyuv kibud and Moira to a father, there's a chiyuv of kibud and Moira to a Rebbe, because a Rebbe is an Av. That's where the chiyuv kavod comes from. There's a Yismach Moshe, the originator of the Chasidus, the Satmar Rebbe was an enical of the Yismach Moshe. There's a Yismach Moshe at the end of Parshas Vayera. And the Yismach Moshe says the same Yisai. But says the Yismach Moshe, that's what the Mishnah in Bava Metzia is coming to tell us. The Mishnah in Bava Metzia is coming to tell us that a Rebbe is a father. The father, the physical, biological father, brings the child Olam Hazeh. The Rebbe brings the child Olam Haba, and therefore the child is the Rebbe's son. The Rebbe is a father. That's what the Mishnah in Bava Metzia is saying, that you're going to return the Aveda of the Rebbe, because he's also a father. Now, if we take this Yesod from the Mabit and the Yismach Moshe, and we put it together with the Yesod of Rabbi Yosef Engel, we could reconcile the two Mishnayos. The svara that the Mishnah in Krisa says of Ata v'avicha chayavin b'kvaid rabach, that svara Rabbi Yosef Engel says is only shayach when the two chiyuvim of kibud are equal. So comes the Mishnah in Bava Metzia and says, you know what? You have two fathers. You have a father that biologically gave birth to you, and you have a Rebbe who's also your father. So now I have two equal chiyuvim of kavod. I have a chiyuv kavod to my father, who's my father, and I have a chiyuv kavod to my Rebbe, who's also my Av. How do I distinguish? Equal, father. Comes the Mishnah in Krisis and tells us, you have two equal chiyuvim of kavod. Memela, your Rebbe comes first, because Ata v'avicha chayavim b'kvaid rabach. So you need both Mishnayos. Both Mishnayos are two halves of one beautiful whole, and they both come together and join to explain why the Rebbe comes first. The Mishnah of Metzia is coming to explain why the chiyuv of kibud to your father and to your Rebbe are equal, because they're both fathers. This one's mevi'ul olam hazeh, this one's mevi'ul olam haba, so they're both fathers. Comes along the Mishnah in Krisis and says, now that they're both equal, the Rebbe comes first, because now you can apply the svara of Ata v'avicha chayavin b'kvaid rabach. So they're both equal, and you need both Mishnayos, and both Mishnayos are two halves of a beautiful whole. That's it's included in the pshat of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh that he says in his Pirush on Shulchan Aruch. So that would be another way of reconciling the two Mishnayos. It's just it's late. Leave with one thing to think about based on the things that we said. When your child is sitting at your table, and you're there, and your father's there, so the child's sitting with his father and his grandfather, and the child brings the food to the table, should he first give it to you, the father, or does he give it first to your father, the Zayda? What's the proper anhaga for the child to do? Something to think about based on some of the marmakainas we discussed, and see what you come out with maskana. Shkaya.